and understand the Keynesian Cross a bit better. I'm doing this video even though I know there's loads of videos on the Keynesian Cross online. I just feel there's some certain points that they don't fully explain, and therefore I think that's where it's leading to confusions. So before I really just get into the Keynesian Cross diagram, which, yeah, look, you could just memorise and rote learn and then be able to hopefully answer a question on it, I think there's a few things that are kind of missing in other videos that are making this quite difficult to understand. So firstly, obviously we need to understand a bit more about kind of like output or GDP, and I'm going to do a whole video on really breaking down this definition here, but for the purposes of this video, I think kind of just writing it out as its definition and highlighting a few things will kind of get the point across. So GDP, the way I like to have the definition down is as the following. So my definition of GDP here is the final value of all new goods and services produced in a country in a given time period. And there's a few things I'm going to hopefully underline for you. Final, new, a country, and a given time period. I know that kind of looks as if I've highlighted a lot of what's going on here, but again, so the final, so I don't care about all the bits in between, I just care about the final good. It has to be new, so it can't be that it was made in, I don't know, 2018 and now it's counting in 2019. It has to be new. One country has to be the one it's produced in and in a certain time period, so the time frame really matters. Now, what I've done this for is because at no point have I ever talked about the point of when things get sold. I'm only ever talking about when it gets produced, so we don't care about whether or not it's been sold. So if we make a load of this, pretend we're a factory and we're making something and it's then on the shop floor, and I don't know, let's say I make 50 slippers, 50 pairs of slippers, okay? And I make them within the right time frame, that counts towards the GDP in that current time period, okay? If only, let's say, I don't know, 40 actually sell, so if 40 sell, it's not that only 40 count towards the GDP, 50 count towards the GDP, okay? So you're probably thinking, well, what's happened to those other 10? Those 10 class as, they go towards what's known as inventories. And in kind of the GDP terms, this just classes as investment or unplanned, unplanned inventory change, okay? Now, some firms do plan for this. They do plan, well, I'm going to make this many and I expect that they won't all sell and therefore I can add this amount to the inventories. That's fine, but I'm just using a very simplified example where I'm saying we've made 50 in the hopes that we're going to sell 50, and what happens in reality is only 40 of them sell and therefore 10 of them go towards inventories, which counts towards investment in terms of GDP, and therefore it does all still count towards GDP in that time period, okay? So this is really, really important. It doesn't matter about how many of them sell. Let's get away from thinking that immediately. What we know from the introductory video on Keynesian economics, what I did, is that we know that Keynes was very much kind of like a demand side person. He fully believed that when we have kind of like issues with recessions or depressions, is all to do with inadequate spending. That's what Keynes fully believed. And therefore, the whole of kind of Keynesian theory is based on this idea that total income or output is largely determined by the spending plans of people in the economy. So who do we have? We have like consumers, we have firms, we have government. So what Keynes fully believed is that the total income, the output of an economy is largely determined by the spending plans of people in the economy. And who do we have? We have households, so people like you and me, the general public, we have firms or businesses, and we also have government. So how they're choosing to spend their money is what's going to kind of overall impact the economy. And then what he's gone and done is he's built a really simplistic model, the Keynesian Cross, that is an attempt to kind of like model all of this. We've just established what we really care about is kind of like the people in the economy and how they plan to spend given different kind of income levels. Now, what we've got here is, you've probably seen this before, you can write planned expenditure as equal to consumption plus investment plus government plus net exports. I put this in brackets because sometimes if we're just doing the Keynesian Cross, we're going to pretend it's a really simplified closed economy and therefore we're not going to worry about this. Okay, so let's have a little think about this more. So this consumption, it obviously depends on why. When you think about consuming things, you think about, well, given certain levels of different income or certain amount of money, I'm going to change how much I consume. Okay, now this is the consumption by the general public. This isn't like firms' production. Okay, we're going to refocus on this being consumption. Now this C is what firms tackle to produce towards. They want to produce so much they're kind of meeting C. Okay, let's just keep that in mind. Investment, that's very different. That's the kind of like purchasing of any capital equipment to go towards future production, or it could be that you want to have a change in inventories. Remember, we discussed that earlier. Anything that you're producing but not selling would go towards inventories, and some firms do have some kind of plan for that. So they do say, well, I would like to overproduce slightly and then I can have this in inventories for a specific reason, okay? Specific reason. But typically, it's all the changing in inventories isn't always planned for, okay? And then you've got your classic government spending. So let's have a think about how this is going to look graphically. So like we just said, all of these depends on your income or your Y. If this increases, we'd expect that you'd plan to spend more. So let's draw our line like this. Again, it's allowed to be upward sloping, or it's a reasonable assumption for it to be upward sloping, because as your income increases, you would expect to spend more. Fine. Okay. Now, you've probably also, if you come into this video, you've seen the Keynesian Cross before. They do this funny kind of like dotted line, or it doesn't have to be dotted, but the reason why they're drawing it here is because it's exactly at 45 degrees. Now, what does that mean? Well, a graph has a 90-degree angle. This is exactly banging halfway. So if you ever do a 45-degree line, what this should mean is that every single point on this line, your y-axis and your x-axis are equal. So for example, this number here, if this was, 20, for example, if you do that and go down to corresponding, it should also be 20. They're exactly equal. So on this here, what this means is that planned expenditure has equaled kind of actual, so outcome. Okay. And what we like is we think about in economics is, well, at what point are these the same? Because when they're the same, it means that what we've planned for has been realised, is what's actually happening. And that's why it's here, is where we are exactly where PE equals Y. So this point here is what's known as equilibrium. And if you're at equilibrium, you essentially should want to stay there because your plans have kind of been realised, okay? But unfortunately, we have situations in the economy when we're not in equilibrium. And there's, on this diagram, we've got two instances of that. We can either be to the right or we could be to the left of the diagram. So let's look at what happens if we're to the right of the diagram. We can see we've got this discrepancy. We can see we've got this kind of like 45-degree line, this line that we really want to be on, but we're not. We're actually, we've got this black line here. So what we can see is that what we've actually produced, so actual outcome of the economy, is higher than what we've planned for. So what does this mean, really? This means that we've produced too much. Now, you might be thinking, well, I don't get it. Like, why would that happen? Why would we essentially plan for something and then go and produce too much more? Well, the plan is based on consumer demand, right? And it could be that firms have accidentally anticipated that wrong or forecasted that wrong. So they produced too much because they managed to kind of like estimate this wrong, for example. Okay, and how would we know that we've produced too much? Well, if you think about you being a shop owner, maybe it's a shop just full of stuff that you've made, you'd potentially see lots left on the shelf. And that signals to you, oh, hang on a minute, I've produced too much. And if we produce too much and it doesn't sell, what does that do? Well, it means that we see a change, we see an increase in unplanned inventories. Now, it could be that I had said to myself, well, I want to produce more than it's going to sell. So, for example, I want to produce 50, knowing full well that I want 10 to not sell. I want to overproduce. But if that's the case, that would have already been accounted for in I, okay? Because we've planned for that and that would have been accounted for in I. But that isn't what's happening here. Because this line is greater than this, we've seen that there must have been even more that didn't sell than what we had like predicted or forecasted for. And I think this kind of like explanation is what's missing in other videos of the Keynesian Cross. They just automatically say, well, we see that inventories have risen and therefore X, Y, or Z happens. But it doesn't kind of get the idea as to like why that might happen. And it's this idea because we have this firms got to produce kind of on a forecast or what they think demand would be, and they're not going to get that perfect every time, okay? So what we see then is we see that things are being left on the shelf much more than we'd planned for, and you wouldn't continually want to operate at this. You've got loads and loads of leftover stock, and therefore eventually, because this signal's passed through to you, you'd say, okay, I think I've estimated what the demand would be wrong, and therefore we'd find ourselves gradually going left. I would start to produce less as a firm, and therefore we'd go left and we'd get back to equilibrium. Okay? Now, similarly, we could be to the left of this equilibrium point, so we could be here. And what's happening here is that what we're producing is lower, so the red line is lower than the black line. So we're producing too little. And that would be obvious because if I had stock on my shelves, I would find that like maybe lots of empty shelves, selling out very, very quickly. And even though I'm selling out, I know that I've got more customers wanting more of my products. It's not as if I've got it perfect, okay? So there are people still wanting to come and willing to buy the goods at that set price, and therefore I know that, hang on a minute, I've underproduced. Now, yes, we could have already leftover stock in inventories, in storage, for example, and we could bring them out and start selling them. And if they're selling, that's giving us an idea that there's still demand. But in kind of like the future, I would say to myself, I know I'm underproducing. I know I could produce more and it to be sold, and therefore in the future what we'd see that this message would pass along, and therefore I'd go and produce more and we'd eventually get ourselves back to equilibrium. So what is this all about then? So this Keynesian Cross, all it's really focusing on is how unplanned inventories change. Because firms are always trying to kind of like forecast or estimate what demand would be, and they are not always going to get it correct, because Y is what we produce, right? It doesn't mean everything has to sell. So Y in terms of GDP, like we just mentioned, it's all about what's produced. It's not about whether it's all going to sell or not. And therefore this diagram takes into account how inventories are what's happening to unplanned inventories. Are they rising or are they falling? And if they are, then we're in disequilibrium. And that message will eventually pass through and we'll get ourselves back to equilibrium. So hopefully, not only does this help to explain Keynesian Cross, it's given a bit more background into firstly why this model's formed. It's because Keynes is very much thinking that it's like spending or planned spending that spurs on the economy, and why it is the case that we could end up in these disequilibrium points. I just feel that other videos, they obviously show this diagram and they tell you what would happen, but I don't think they make it entirely clear like how or why we could be at a disequilibrium point. So I hope that helps.